Um, there we go. Welcome panelists and guests to the 7th Mapping Populism panel hosted by ECPS, where we will be exploring the evolution of populism in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Belarus. Over the course of the last year, we have been hosting panel sessions that bring scholars together to discuss the state of political populism in the different regions of Europe. So far, we've done 6 sessions, hosted 30 prominent scholars, and covered Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Balkan region, as well as Europe's sort of heartland. Our panelists have provided expert insight into the national trends of populist development and far-right movements across Europe. The aim is to have a complete picture of populism in Europe following the conclusion of this panel series. After each session, ECPS publishes a panel report alongside a video recording on its website. Through this, we hope to provide an invaluable source of information, not only for scholars, but also for a wider audience, which includes policymakers concerned by the current challenges to democracy in Europe. Starting in 2023, we will be moving beyond the borders of Europe and expanding the project to include sort of thematic cases that link populism, as well as cases of populism around the world. Following this, I am very excited to introduce our moderator and our panelists today. So our moderator is Dr. Andres Kaskamp. He's a professor at Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Previously, he was a professor of Baltic politics at the University of Tartu in Estonia and director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. He's the author of books titled The Radical Right in Interwar Estonia and A History of the Baltic States. His research interests include populist radical right parties, memory politics, European foreign and security policy, and cooperation in conflict in the Baltic Sea region. And he also serves as the editor for the Journal of Baltic Studies, as well as being the president of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. Our first panelist is Dr. Jogel Ulinskaite. Sorry for the pronunciation. She's an assistant professor of political science and a research fellow at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. Her research focuses on populism and its links to the sort of emotional narratives about the past. She's also been a part of a research team that has carried out several projects on the collective memory of the communist and post-communist past in Lithuania. Her work at Yale University in the spring of 2022 centered on the reconstructing of the emotional narratives of the post-communist transformation from oral history interviews about the Soviet and post-Soviet past, post-communist past in Lithuania. We then have Dr. Mari-Lise Jakobsen, who is an associate professor of political sociology at Tallinn University. And she's also a former fellow of the Baltic Studies program at the Yale Macmillan Center. In 2012, she was the PI for the project Populism in the Baltic States, commissioned by the Open Estonia Foundation. And she has also served as worked as a researcher for the Estonian contact point of the European Migration Network, and serves as a country expert for the Global Citizenship Observatory. Her recent research focuses on the transnationalization of populist parties, and she has recently published in journals Contemporary Politics and the European Political Science, as well as being the lead editor of the book The Anxieties of Migration and Integration in Turbulent Times, which is forthcoming. Our third speaker is Dr. Alexandra Kaczynska-Zonik, who is a research assistant at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin and the head of the Baltic Department of the Institute of Central Europe in Lublin also. She is a doctor in political science, in humanities, and in the field of archaeology. She's a laureate of the Polish research programs of Mobility Plus and Miniatura, and her research interests involve politics and security in East Central Europe and the post-Soviet space, as well as the Baltic states and Russian minorities in the Baltic states and Soviet heritage. Finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Tatiana Kulakevich, who is an assistant professor of instruction at the University of South Florida's School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies. Dr. Kulakevich, who was born and raised in Belarus, is a research fellow and affiliated at the faculty of USF Institute on Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies. Her analyses on the affairs of Eastern Europe have appeared in multiple media and academic journals, including the Washington Post, the Global Post, International Migration, the Journal of Belarusian Studies, and many more. So with these brilliant scholars here today, I will now pass the floor to Dr. Kaskamp to give us a brief introduction on the state of populism in Belarus and the Baltics.
Thank you, Martin. Let me just add that after the presentations, we will, of course, have a Q&A and a discussion for about half an hour, so everyone will have a chance to express their views and get some comments from the presenters. But my task here in the beginning is simply to provide a little bit of an overview of the four countries, and then specifically look a little bit at the populists, specifically the populist radical right, in all four of those. So let me just say from the beginning that all four countries started from the same place, emerging from the Soviet Union in 1991. But there was, of course, a very important difference in that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were restored states. They had been independent during the interwar period between the two world wars, whereas Belarus was a successor state, a new state from the USSR. Three Baltic states moved decisively to integrate with the West, while Belarus became a dictatorship aligned with Moscow. And most recently, in 2020, it's been the same dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, who's been in charge for several decades now. 2020, massive electoral fraud, which led to massive protests and violent repression of the protesters. And now in the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine, Belarus has been a staging ground and an ally in Russia in this war, and has thus also been a target for Western sanctions. The Baltic countries, on the other hand, have become successful multi-party democracies. In 2004, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined the European Union. They joined NATO. A few years later, they joined the single currency, the Eurozone, and they have been really the only true success stories of the post-Soviet space. A complication in their sort of domestic politics, particularly for Estonia and Latvia, has been that they also host large ethnic Russian minorities. And thus there's always been an ethnic cleavage in the domestic politics of Estonia and Latvia. In the current situation, this is also important because this reflects on popular opinion regarding the war in Ukraine. The Baltic states regard themselves as frontline states and are the biggest supporters in terms of the percentage per capita that they are spending to support Ukraine militarily and with humanitarian aid. And they feel that this is their struggle as well. Now, after this little overview of these countries, a few words about populism and the populist radical right. Now, I've been involved in studying the radical right before populism got added to the term. It was Kasmude who in 2007 came up with the term the populist radical right. Before that, the term that was mostly used was extreme right parties. There's always been confusion with terminology, but Kasmude's definition from 2007, this populist radical right, is the one that most scholars use. And it has sort of three core components: nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. And by nativism, we mean not just nationalism, but a ethno-nationalism, an exclusionary xenophobic nationalism. By authoritarianism, obviously, it means this desire for or admiration for a sort of a charismatic strongman, but also it means being tough on crime, being much more important recently. It also includes, say, what are called traditional family values, which are authoritarian values. And finally, populism itself, which is this thin ideology that basically means, the framing that the people versus this corrupt elite. Those are sort of the three core components of what are referred to as the populist radical right in general, and what we'll be talking about today. And when these are usually discussed, then the focus generally, because it's usually political scientists who are doing this, it's usually the focus is on political parties. Now, a few words specifically about the populist radical right in the countries that we'll be discussing today. Well, let me start with Latvia, where Latvia has a tradition of new political parties being formed and doing extremely well in elections. In fact, until 2006, a new party which hadn't existed at the previous elections won each of the successive elections in that country. And in more recent elections, also new parties have been formed that have done extremely well. So the system has been quite volatile, and it's been open for new populist challengers. Now, speaking specifically of the radical right in Latvia, then the National Alliance, a core part of it, which is the radical right group that used to be known as All for Latvia, has in fact been in the Latvian government for a very long time as a junior member of the coalition for many years running. And Latvia just recently in October had elections. And yesterday was finally announced that the new government has finally been formed. And this party is once again part of the coalition. Now, as for Estonia, Estonia was an outlier in the sense that there really wasn't any significant far-right party in parliament for a very long time. The breakthrough came only in 2015, a party known as EKRE, the Estonian Conservative People's Party, which made its breakthrough over the 5% threshold to get into parliament, and has grown ever since, is now been steadily for several years the second most popular party in Estonia. And Estonia is having elections in March, so it's not outside the realm of possibility that EKRE could form the government with a coalition of several other partners. Finally, Lithuania, amongst the three Baltic states, has also seen populists of many stripes, not just of the right, but also the left and the center. Most notably, I would say Lithuania in 2004 had a populist president who was actually impeached. And unlike Donald Trump, Rolandas Paksas was actually removed from office in 2004. Something that's very remarkable on a global level. As for Belarus, it's very difficult for me to say anything about a populist party there, because I don't see there's not much space for any sort of organized political activity in a repressive authoritarian regime. And I'm eager to hear what our presenter, how our presenter will enlighten us on this. And then finally, a few words in the last minutes allotted to me, the sort of issues which have sort of shaped the narrative for the populist radical right recently in the region, just as elsewhere, of course, has been the pandemic. COVID has given a boost to these parties because they have rallied citizens in the name of freedom against governmental control. It's been aligned with the anti-vax movement and promoted all sorts of conspiracies. The war in Ukraine, I think, has also provided a boost in certain ways. In that, and I'm particularly speaking about the Estonian case, which I know best, that EKRE, in this case, has railed against the Ukrainian refugees, has voted against financial support for Ukraine, and in general has been in blaming Brussels for higher inflation, higher energy costs, these price hikes. Instead of blaming the war initiated by Putin for this inflation, they are trying to neatly shift the blame to the green agenda, which is being promoted by the European Commission. And of course, this goes hand in hand with climate change denial. And finally, I would say a unique feature of the populist radical right in our region is, unlike the populist radical right in many other places, in most other places, in fact, it hasn't been pro-Russian. And this is obviously clear because the Baltic states have been occupied by Russia, dominated by Russia for a long time. So their history is quite distinct from that of the rest of Europe. However, as I just mentioned with the narrative about being anti-refugee and the higher prices and inflation, you could say that these parties are sort of functionally in line with many of the talking points of the Kremlin in sort of undermining and polarizing the cohesion of societies in the region. And perhaps I will stop there and now allow the experts in each of the countries to have their say, beginning with Lithuania.
Thank you. I'll just share my slides. Do you all see my slides? Perfect. Thank you. So thanks for having me at this interesting panel, and thanks for kind and deep, I would say, introduction into this region. So my presentation today is more about the legacy of post-communist transformation in the agenda of Lithuanian populist political parties. And I wanted to start my presentation with a sort of paradox that I want to try to disentangle in my short talk. So it has already been said that we do experience and we do notice decline of democracy and illiberalism in Central Eastern Europe, and it's widely discussed topic. And academic studies apparently often focus on Hungary and Poland, assuming that the insights would apply for the whole region. However, when we look into the data, for example, in this graph, we see a kind of different picture. This graph compares several countries in the region, and according to the VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, Liberal Democracy Index, you can see that in contrast to Hungary and Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia are still stable democracies. And the question is why? What are the differences between those countries and those countries which had similar beginnings after the collapse of Soviet Union, but it seems that their paths sort of diverged. So one of possible or intuitive explanations would be that perhaps the Baltic countries, and Lithuania in particular, have not been tempted by populist, but it's not the case. As it has been already mentioned, already in 2003, populist president Rolandas Paksas has been elected as a president. So he actually can be considered a forerunner of presidents such as Donald Trump, due to a rather intense and controversial election campaign. So what you see in this picture is actually excerpt of his campaign. He piloted a plane and at the same time claimed that he represents ordinary people of Lithuania. So the electoral manifesto, electoral program was directed against the political elite and was supposed to represent a revenge of those who had been somehow disillusioned with Lithuania's development and had lost out in the post-communist transformation. As it was mentioned correctly, he was impeached in 2004. As you can see, some quotes from his program. So he was claiming that respect for people should be guaranteed by restoring faith in the future and self-confidence, democracy for the people, freedom for business, and dictatorship for mafia. So those are really representative quotes, I would say, of his campaign. So even though he was impeached in 2004, because he violated the constitution and his oath of office, he actually founded radical right Populist Party and continued his political career. But what's important, I would say, is that Populist president is just one part of the story in Lithuania. So Lithuania's party system faced populist parties rather early on. They started as early as the third generation election, which is in 2000, when the new Union Party was elected. We would probably call it more like centrist populist party. And as this graph shows, populist parties have been successful in all subsequent elections. Moreover, in 2004 and 2016, they won more seats than the two main competing Lithuanian political parties, Homeland Union and Social Democrats. So the question is then, what can explain the stability of the democracy in the country? Or conversely, why populist political parties have not been able to take control of state institutions despite their electoral success? So I will show you one more graph of share of mandates won by political parties in parliamentary election. So first, as you can see, the party system in Lithuania is still dominated by two blocs, by Social Democrats and the Homeland Union. So those were two parties which established because of the cleavage appeared during post-communist transformation, or actually during independence movement, and they are continuing winning many seats in the parliament. So they usually win actually most seats in the parliament, but in addition, every election sees a new populist party winning a large number of seats, sometimes more, sometimes less. So in 2000, you have New Union. In 2004, you have Order and Justice and Labour Party, National Resurrection Party in 2008, the Way of Courage in 2012, and Lithuanian Greens and Farmers and Greens Union in 2016. But what you can also see from this graph is that most populist parties succeed in a single election. That means in subsequent elections, the number of seats held by populist parties decreases. So that means they cannot maintain voter support. So the question is, why is that? So one of the explanations is that they usually base their campaign on the project of newness. So they do not develop a comprehensive political program or do not attempt to take up new ideological issues and achieve success based on the project of newness. But that kind of project works only for one election. The win is lower due to the subsequent election in most of the cases. As you can see, also exception is Labour Party and Order and Justice, which managed to find their place in the party system and after their success in 2004. And the other exception is the experienced political party, the Lithuanian Farmers and Greens Union, which reinvented itself as a new political force and won most seats in parliament in 2016. They actually also won the most seats of any populist parties ever in Lithuania. So what else can explain the results of populist parties and the fact that in most cases they are not re-elected? So I argue that one of the explanations is Lithuanian parliamentary election system, which is complex and has two parts. So Lithuanian parliament is elected, half of members of parliament are elected in single seat constituencies, and half of members are elected by proportional representation. So in the end, it's difficult to win in both single mandate and proportional part of the election. And actually, the research, Tavits, Ivanskas, they show that to be able to win in both parts of the election, you have to have a strong political party organizations and have many members. So both strong organization and campaign spending are important for winning elections in such a mixed system. So populist parties, in order to win, they need to attract and retain members in order to compete successfully. However, and this is where the legacy of the post-communist transformation or communist past comes into play. So in Lithuania, as in many Central and Eastern European countries, public distrust of parties is very high. So that makes it difficult for new political parties to attract members. And what you can see here is that Social Democratic Party of Lithuania is the largest political party, Homeland Union is the second, Labour Party is the third, and all the other parties have less than 10,000 members. So as a result, they are unable to build strong party organizations and have little chance to sustaining victory. And the other route, meaning attracting private funding or have huge political campaigns based on extensive funding, has been restricted in 2012. So with the law amended in 2011, funding from legal persons, and especially business, was restricted. So political parties are subject to extensive restrictions on private income and donations, and they receive public funding, which is allocated according to their share of the vote in previous elections. So coming back to this graph, so we have two explanations. One is campaign strategy, the other is electoral system and regulations. But what other interesting thing is, I would say, is that we do not see the so-called cordon sanitaire for populist parties in Lithuania. Actually, most populist political parties, when elected, they joined the governing coalition and got posts in the government. That happened in 2000 with New Union, which was in coalition with Social Democrats, in 2004 with the Labour Party, in 2008, in 2012, and lastly in 2016, the Social Democrats joined the coalition led by Farmers and Greens Union. So after being in government, they do lose outsiders' appeal. And another thing which I find interesting is that even though they usually are part of the government, the governing coalitions most often are led by either Social Democrats or Homeland Union. So these two parties often get more mandates than any other political parties. And so far, the pendulum principle seems to guarantee that the two largest political parties win elections and are not actually encouraged to capture the state. So the two main rivals, the Homeland Union and the Social Democrats, have so far not embraced authoritarian populism. And it's important because previous studies have already found that in Central Eastern European countries, threat to democracy more often stems from elites who take control of mainstream political parties. So in most of the cases, Prime Minister was either from Homeland Union or from Social Democrats, and the exception is 2016, when for the first time the Prime Minister did not come from those two main competing parties in Lithuania. So far I have explained how the electoral system and the party system has prevented populist political parties from succeeding in elections, but now I would like to focus on aforementioned exception, or the victory of the Lithuanian Farmers and Greens Union in 2016. So what they did achieve in this election, they combined credibility, which is, according to Steinman Kelzel, is necessary for populist parties to win elections, and they also combined the project of newness. They reinvented this itself as a new political force and were won most of the seats. They also attracted people involved in other organizations and movements. So they reinvented themselves as more of a movement rather than traditional party. They used the image of strong leader, strong and just leader. They constructed the elite people divide, so sort of constructing the two Lithuanians divide. That's how it's called in Lithuania. And this makes it similar to a presidential campaign of Rolandas Paksas, claiming to represent those who are disillusioned with the direction of Lithuania, appealing to the sense of loss experienced during the transition. So the aim of that kind of campaign is to represent those that do not identify with either Social Democrats or Homeland Union. And finally, for the ideology, they tried to intervene between the two poles of the party system and propose a third way. So they occupied an ideological niche of a party that is conservative in those sort of cultural values and economically left-wing. So what they did, they emphasized traditional family and Christian values as a basis for uniting society. They claimed that they are concerned for public health, though they were actually more concerned about moral decay of society. They focused on the ethnic nation and the revival of the mythical pagan Christian past. They tapped into feelings of loss and of not being represented in public sphere. The aim was to represent the so-called losers of the transformation without specifying who they are. That means that anyone could be part of this category they like or be like it. And I argue that's the legacy of post-communist transformation. And finally, what they did, they linked that feeling of loss with hope and well-being through unity. So finally, although the party's voters do not differ significantly in their ideological preferences from voters of other political parties, the voters of Lithuanian Farmers and Greens Union can be described as hopeful voters, in a sense that they are dissatisfied with the economic situation, but believe in change, newness, and possibility of renewal. They remain hopeful, and party represented that. And it's important because this kind of ideological framework was later on during COVID pandemic used by family marches and movements against restrictions. So what they did and what happened when they were in government since 2016. So actually, that was the biggest challenge to democracy. And besides demonstrating strong leadership with tendency towards authoritarianism, they also established a parliamentary commission to investigate the work of previous governments. They established a commission to investigate the operation and management of national broadcaster with aim to restricting it. They attempted to reduce the number of MPs in the parliament. So since constitutional changes are difficult to implement, what they did, they initiated referendum, which did not succeed due to low voter turnout. And finally, they attempted to lower the threshold for party center at the parliament. So nevertheless, the party managed to hold on to its majority only for one term, and its support declined after the election in 2020. Moreover, the party seemed to be surprised by its own victory in 2016. They did not have a clear plan of what changes they wanted to bring about, and were more likely to improvise than to work towards systemic change. And for the conclusion, so summarizing, where do I see the legacy of post-communist transformation? So for one, it has to be stated again that Lithuanian democracy is not immune to the lure of populism and the decline of democracy. And the legacy of transformation created both opportunities for populists, but also limits their success. So party system is still dominated by the cleavage that emerged during the independence movement between Social Democrats and Homeland Union. Populist parties try to intervene between those poles, trying to take the best of both sides. Low political participation in the society limits the attraction of new members and the establishment of new strong populist political parties, and that limits their electoral success. And finally, those repeated attempts to construct and represent the losers of transformation, while at the same time elevating the status and pride of those who were not at the forefront of transformation and reform might lead to success, but that does not guarantee long-term electoral success. So thank you for your attention. And looking forward to discussion and your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Dr. Mary-Lis Jacobsen, who will be presenting about Estonia.
Thank you very much. And on my part as well, it's a privilege to be here. So I titled my talk as comparing the far right in Estonia to a blossoming tree. I'm not trying to glorify this movement, but I thought it's a good metaphor to explain kind of the stage in which this movement is at the moment. So it's doing really well, as Andres also mentioned. It's built on pretty solid grounds, as a tree would be. But if we think about what the sakura, the blossoming cherry tree, represents in Japanese culture, then it also is kind of a something that can fade away, that it's not necessarily permanent. So we'll see how it goes in Estonia, but I would like to discuss the roots, the trunk or the core, and the blossoms of this tree in the next 15 minutes. Estonia is not maybe the world's most best known country, but we love to talk about ourselves as this progressive country, the e-Estonia with the e-voting and the e-government and things like this. Estonians in general are also fairly Euro-optimistic and progressive in those terms. And for a long time, it felt like there is no place for the far right in Estonia apart from the electoral margins. So there have always been like small groups or parties, but they haven't been electorally significant. But this picture has changed over the past 10 years, I would say. And today I'm also going to talk mostly about EKRE, which also Andres mentioned, the Conservative People's Party of Estonia, which was founded in late 2012. This year, the Estonian Independence Party was discontinued. So it was a marginal party, but a Eurosceptic party. So this is out of the picture now. What else is important is probably EKRE's youth branch, which is called the Blue Awakening, Sinine Äratus. It was founded in 2014 and is, I would say, even more to the far right from EKRE. In comparison, EKRE is kind of pretty much a middleweight party. In addition, what is definitely deserves a mention is the Foundation for the Protection of Family and Tradition, which is part of the American-born nationalist Catholic movement for tradition, family, and property. Estonia is a very non-religious country and non-Catholic country, but this organization has established itself really, really strongly in the Estonian public sphere. And yes, in 2016, we also had another transnational import, the Soldiers of Odin, from the Nordic countries, which was kind of an informal movement of people who were protecting the streets from immigrants. And this surfaced in 2016 at the height of this European migration crisis, as it's called. But going back 30 or more years, in many ways, what is considered the far right in Western Europe isn't that far right in Estonia. And we have to go back into 1988. The first party, which was not the Communist Party, which was established in Estonia, was the Estonian National Independence Party. And this was certainly an anti-establishment party, nationalist party, and said that Estonia ought to be free and we should kind of go back to the situation where we left off in the 1940s. So we can say that this kind of anti-establishment and also ethnocentrist, nationalist sentiment is nothing in the fringes in Estonia. This is like I would say, hegemonic ideology in many ways. And this is kind of moved forward in time as well. And the Pro-Patria Party and all of its successors are in the political mainstream of Estonia. So this is a national conservative party, but still kind of different from EKRE. So this is the backdrop for EKRE, let's say, or the populist radical right in Estonia. But we shouldn't disregard the other political edge of the spectrum either. So the kind of counter movement to ERSP in the late 1980s, early 1990s was the Popular Front. And this was, well, more left-wing and more inclusionary, which said that the transformation to independence ought to be more gradual. The more than 300,000 Russian citizens, or 1/3 of the population, should not lose their citizenship rights, etc. In Estonia, and it kind of proposed this kind of not so nationalist or ethnocentric alternative. Later, this turned into the Center Party, which was a moderate, center-left party with clear populist sentiments as well. This was its long time leader, Edgar Savisaar. Here he's doling out potatoes and firewood to people before elections. So you can see where I'm going with this. And the Center Party was for a long time in the cordon sanitaire in Estonian politics, not so much because of its populism, but because of its ties to Russia. And so we have a history of the cordon sanitaire, which has changed in the past few years. All of the parties which are in parliament have been in the government in the past 4 years, or even less, past 3 years, let's say. So the situation changed for the Center Party in 2016 when it got a new chairman, Jüri Ratas, who later became prime minister, and he explicitly said that he is not for the cordon sanitaire, and he sees that every party deserves an opportunity in government in a democratic country. So that was also how EKRE got into the government in 2019. But let's still wind back some 10 years. So how did EKRE come about? In 2011, we witnessed something that I would call an anti-populist moment in Estonian politics. So the Center Party was still there, but we had an election that year and only 4 parties made it into the parliament. We haven't had so few parties in the parliament ever. And there was also this kind of broad dissatisfaction with the political elites in the society. Estonia has a really, let's say, minimal protest culture. People almost never go to the streets or express their political opinions. But that was the year we actually saw this kind of rallies for very, very different reasons. And this kind of created a momentum for new political parties. It was not just EKRE at that moment. We also got a new Free Party, which electorally marginalized later on. But that was the setting in which EKRE emerged. And since it's quite difficult to initiate a new political party in Estonia, you used to need 1,000 people, which is 0.1% of the whole population of eligible people, to form a party. Now it's down to 500 people. And EKRE came about as they wanted, or they like to call it, a union between the People's Union, which was a left of center agrarian party, and the Estonian National Movement, which was a small NGO with like 300 members. And the People's Union had close to 10,000 in its heyday. And so in late 2012, EKRE was established. It also inherited all of its members from the People's Union, and even up to today, more than half of EKRE's members have actually never joined EKRE, but they've joined one of its predecessors. Right. So these are the roots, I would say. Let's move on to the trunk or the core of the tree. I won't go in detail with all of these points, but I'm sure that this list kind of creates a pretty familiar picture to anyone who's been in the populist radical right studies. You've got all of these, typical keywords here of being against the left-wing multiculturalism, being cultural nationalists, not so much, let's say, I don't know, blood-based nationalist or something like that. EKRE is clearly anti-establishment. It plays a lot to the traditional family values, being anti-immigrant, Eurosceptic. It is always campaigning against the EU's Green Deal. And it's also techno-skeptic to some extent. So it's also kind of opposing the e-voting system, for instance, or claiming that it's rigged. So what is its overall, let's say, recipe for success in the Estonian case is that it manages to be on the kind of opposing side alone. So a lot of these issues are issues where other political parties have kind of a consensus. So other parties aren't against the EU's Green Deal, for instance, or they don't want to openly show themselves to be anti-immigrant. And then EKRE can come and say that, this is our turf. This is why you should vote for us. Right. And I think, EKRE in many ways fits the profile of a populist radical right-wing party according to the ideational approach in populism studies. It also has several, let's say, typical features in terms of populism as political style. So Piero Stighi or Ben Moffat talk about bad manners of populists or the low politics that they kind of perform. And this is exactly what EKRE does. So during its a bit less than 2 years in government, they had 33 different types of political crises, which they kind of created. About half of those were what I call talk scandals, so places where they expressed something outrageous and this kind of public discussion ensued. So they managed to attack the political establishment, like the president, for instance, the leaders of other countries, the intellectuals, the minorities, and also express, let's say, rather outrageous positions also in terms of the domestic politics of other countries, as in the case of the US. And occasionally they also flirted with more far-right, let's say, imagery. So here on this photo is an EKRE member signing his oath of office when he became an MP, and he used the hand gesture, which is associated with white supremacy. So all of this is here in the case of EKRE. But what is maybe a bit different from what we typically imagine populists to be is its organization. Yes, EKRE is very leader-centric, so the leader of the party is really important, is really in focus in the public debate, and is really important in how the organization is managed as well. And the Helme family is at the center of the party. So here is the son, Martin Helme, and the father, Mart Helme, also using the same gesture to show that it's nothing bad. It's a sign of a good mood, as they put it. So Mart was the first chairman of EKRE, and in 2020, Martin Helme took over. But what is worth mentioned is that the organization of ECRE, although it's inherited in part from the People's Union, it's something that they really invest in. So they've built up a really well-functioning mass party type of organization. It's based on ideology and conviction. They hold this kind of political meetings where speeches are given, and the branch and district level of the organization are really vibrant. The organization also has notable level of internal democratic procedure, I would say, whereas other political parties, for instance, put their electoral lists together in the party's headquarters, let's say, just calculating like which candidates might draw the most votes and so on. Then in ECRE, this is done by popular vote on the district level or on the local level. So they have these features, and even for their slogans, for instance, for the elections, they hold like a competition in the party, and their slogans are kind of created by the party members. So a lot of people send their ideas in, and then they choose something from there. So there is definitely this kind of like a social movement type of air and a strong political organization behind it. It's not just one fleeting leader. And ECRE also has a really effective counterpublic. So they have their own website, the New News, and they have like a friends club on Facebook, which has multiple thousands of members, where ECRE's policies are discussed like continuously, and where the party gets feedback. And actually can go back to Edgar Savisaar and the Center Party here, because they kind of learned the ropes of mass communication thanks to the Center Party. So the Center Party was in a really privileged position in the Tallinn television network, and they hosted their own political shows there. And the only other party that they ever invited was ECRE. So they kind of learned to perform there, thanks to Edgar Savisaar, who is in many ways their political polar opposite. Okay.
You just have 2 more minutes.
Okay, I will stop soon. So now we get to the blossoms. So these are the party ratings from the last 10 years. ECRE is the black line here, and you can see that they remain very much under the electoral threshold until the parliament adopted the Gender Neutral Partnership Act, and they suddenly had a platform and an issue to campaign on, which allowed them to enter the parliament for the first time. The second jump in popularity came with the European migration crisis, which brought their ratings up to 15 to 20%. Then they also got into a coalition government, which didn't do too much good to their ratings, but they had another surge after the government coalition collapsed. Partly thanks to COVID, because now they weren't the implementers of the COVID restrictions, but rather the ones who could rally against the restrictions and claim that they could have managed the situation much better. And now with ECRE scoring around 25%, we are waiting for the election in March. So those were the blossoms. Now the question comes, will this tree bear fruit? Based on what we've seen from ECRE's first turn in governments, they were really loud, but not very effective in kind of turning their program into policy. Partly also because of the other coalition partners who didn't want them to be soloing on everything. But if they had more space for maneuvering, then ECRE is a very active transnational student of Fidesz in Hungary, and a fan as well of PiS, and also was of let's say an apprentice of Donald Trump and an admirer of his political style. So we might imagine what their kind of ideal end goals might be. But I will stop here. If you have any questions, more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will move then towards Latvia with Dr. Kuczynska-Zonik.
Thank you very much. It is extremely difficult to follow my colleagues because as far as I heard, both Estonia and Lithuania are similar to Latvia case, but I would try to, to show Latvia as a more extraordinary country. But as I said, it has a lot of in common when we are talking about free Baltic states. So I titled my presentation, What Attracts People to Populism in Latvia, and I wanted to underline my statement that yes, populism is an ideology which attracts people in this country. And I would like to answer why is it so? Why this ideology is attractive for Latvian society? So we can find several features of Latvian society which make this phenomenon working. So first of all, it's high and quite unrealistic expectation of a new democratic regime after 1991. Following the dissolution of the Soviet regime, there was quite a huge expectation of democracy in Latvia. And after a few years, it turned out that there are more and more problems, economic problems, political dissolution from democracy itself. So society started to be less and less involved in democracy and politics itself. What was important is that people expected that they would gain the high level of democracy and economic development in very quickly. But it turned out that it wasn't impossible in quite a short time. And then social and economic inequalities were more and more visible. We can also interpret the situation in the line with disenchantment theory, according to which quite high enthusiasm, social enthusiasm after in the beginning of 90s become low and low. Based on bad political and economic performance of the state institutions. So once more, we can underline that there was dissolution, frustrations among people which experience bad economic situation, economic problems, unemployment, political scandals, and corruptions. And those all make people withdraw from political participation and lead to political disinterest. This made people more apathetic and create lack of confidence in democratic institution in this country. And we can find several of such elements in political environment, social environment in Latvia in 90s and from 90s. And especially it should be underlined the demographic situation in Latvia. And as it was mentioned at the beginning, Latvia is divided into two main ethnic groups. I mean, majority of ethnic Latvians and Russian speakers who constitute more than 30% of Latvian society. So once more, we've got several cleavage, several lines of division and inequalities in the country. So that's why we can say that, I mean, this environment, social and political environment, create a basis for attractiveness for populist ideology in Latvia. And as it was mentioned as well, one of the main, even the party which is currently in the government, including the government, National Alliance, which was established in 2010, is a party which also can be described as a populist party, which is far-right party, anti-skeptic, anti-immigrant party, which is also anti-European Union party, Eurosceptic, I would say, because several times it criticized the European Union for bureaucracy. And yeah, so but on the other hand, we've got quite relatively big support for this country, because in 2018 it gained 11% of support, and this year in October it was supported by 9% of population in Latvia. But it is not the only one populist party in this country, and I would like to mention at least two of them. So in 2018, we had a party which was called Who Owns the State? This party, and it was quite interesting that in the parliamentary election in 1918, it gained more than 15% of voters, but in relatively a short time, it lost its support, and it is extremely important and typical for Latvia to have quite unstable government, and I mean, the fact that a new party appear in political environment and they, in relatively short time, they disappear. So the situation was the same situation was in case of Who Owns the State party, which, as I said, had got a huge support, relatively huge support, and then lost its support. Yes, and observing recent situation in context of COVID and the context of parliamentary election in October this year in Latvia, we can also mention another parties, populist parties. Latvia's First party, which was established in August last year, and Stability Party established in February 2021. Those parties were established directly before the parliamentary election, because according to Latvian law, new party had to be established at least 1 year before parliamentary election to have ability to participate, to run during the election. So that's why they relatively a number, distinctive number of new parties were established in 2021. And what is common for both Latvia First and the Stability Party is that they are a conservative party. They mentioned Christianity and traditional family as a main elements in their political party, and they include social integration. They talk about social necessary of social integration. And during parliamentary election 2022, they gained more than 10%. I mean, both of them together they gained 13% of voters. So it is relatively great number, and so it all exemplify that populist ideology is very important for Latvia's democracy, and even before the
I believe there was a freeze. Let's hope she comes back.
Of Latvia, bad Wi-Fi connection. So
yeah,
is it?
Yeah, your connection cut out. The last thing you said was that the populist ideology, it exemplifies that populist ideology is very important for Latvian democracy.
Yeah. I mean, So it exemplifies that it is supported by a relatively a big number of Latvian society, and it is what the president of Latvia said before the parliamentary election this year. He stressed that populism is one of the biggest threat for democracy in this country, because in fact, since 1993, 10 to 20% of voters have voted for populist party in parliamentary elections. So 20%, from 10 to 20% is quite a big number as we look at all election in Latvia. I would also pay your attention to COVID, because the situation made populists more and more vocal and more visual in political stand. And several populist leaders participated in mass demonstration rallies against the government in Latvia. They protested against vaccination. They protested against restrictions. So in fact, their activity worked. It means that that society was frustrated because of situation during pandemic in Latvia, and we have to remember that among the Baltic states, Latvia had got quite huge rate of COVID in society, COVID in the society, and the vaccination was not so effective as it was in Lithuania and Estonia. So so in that sense, populist narratives, I mean anti-vaccination, anti-governmental narratives worked and were effective. And finally, I would like to to make some conclusion, because I said that it is attractive ideology in the country, but it doesn't mean that it is a very effective as it is in European Union countries, because it is because of Latvian political system, which is fragmented, which is unstable, and usually those parties gained huge support, but in very short time they lost potential. But on the other hand, there are several factors which still boost the populist rhetoric in the country. For example, in crisis situation, society is more and more vulnerable to such narratives, and especially elderly people, Russian speakers, people with low income. Those people are more vulnerable to populism, and generally speaking, those who are the most dissatisfied with economic situation, social status, with politics in the country, and they present unfavorable attitudes toward the government. If we look at the social support, social trust in the government in Latvia, we can also realize that it is among the lowest in European Union. So as far as I remember, during the COVID, it was more or less 20% of social trust among the government. So it it was explained in I mean, experts said it is decreasing, so stable decrease of social support toward the governmental institutions. So we can expect that in times of crisis, the society would also support such ideologies, such narratives which are common for populism, because they are frustrated, they are negatively, their attitude toward the government would be more and more negative.
Just one more minute.
Yes. So to conclude once more, I would say that yes, it is a potential for populism in Latvia, but on the other hand, there are some factors which make this ideology less effective in long-term perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll pass on to our final panelist before going to the Q&A with Dr. Tatiana Kulakovic.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for having me. My pleasure to be here, and let's talk about the longest serving populist in Eastern Europe, which is Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus. I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to talk about that. So my presentation, I hope you can see it, is called Is Populism in Decline in Belarus? So let's see what happens. So before we begin, I just need to make sure, I need to say a few words about the populism, because when we're going to be talking about Belarus, it's going to be not about far right, not about left, it's going to be about Lukashenko, it himself. So populism is not an ideology or political regime. It can be adopted by right or left. So it's very ambiguous term. And in Belarus, yes, the country has officially registered 15 political parties. There are also parties that are not officially registered because they are opposition parties, at least 4. The key point here is that because the election process in Belarus is administrative formality, political parties are largely irrelevant in political sphere. So we are going to be talking about populism as a strategy and as a type of politics that claims to represent the opinions and wishes of ordinary people, which was Lukashenko's strategy and it worked for him for more than 2 decades. So he came to power after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1994 and has been in power ever since. So his populism had 3 components, or has 3 components, or ingredients, so building blocks, whatever you call them. So the first one is the feeling of, he was creating the feeling of proximity between the leader and the people. So, digging potatoes, meeting people at the factories, talking, being informal with people. There are a lot of memes about his phrases and talks, how close he is from regular, he's a regular man as everybody else, and that and it's not surprising that the people and he was known as the Batka, which is the father of the nation, well, at least before the 2020 protests. So the second pillar, the second ingredient, was that he was the guarantor of the peace. So plenty of books has been written about the strategy and the importance of the Great Patriotic War as a narrative in Belarusian politics, that Belarusian people suffered so much from the World War II that it should not be repeated, and that Belarusian nation is a peaceful nation. And even in the anthem, it says that the anthem of Belarus starts as "We Belarusians are peaceful people," and this phrase was personally adopted or confirmed, or accepted by Lukashenko himself in 2002. And it was a big, long process of this wording of the new anthem words, and he decided that's a good one. So number 3 is that he was a guarantor of stability also. Stability meaning economic stability. So he is, it's like my favorite picture, one of my favorites. So he is actually taller than Putin, and but he was surviving. The Belarusian economy was never transformed into a market economy. The Belarusian economy was basically surviving based on the Russian subsidies and the ability of Lukashenko to balance between the East and the West. So when he didn't like what Putin was saying, he was saying, well, let me release some political prisoners and tell the European Union how that I'm being a good boy, give me some money, basically. So that balancing, but notice the year of 2019 on the picture. So 2019 was when Russian government decided to introduce a tax maneuver and integration ultimatum. So that means that basically Russia decided finally, or suddenly, or not even suddenly, basically the decision was made to for Belarus, saying like, that's enough. Let's make this Lukashenko pay for oil like everybody else, like world prices. And that started in 2019. So this was affecting the Belarusian economy after 2019. So basically the populism in Belarus worked because he made people believe that the political elite was doing the best for them. But his image of not a good boy or not a good guy was exposed in 2020, and it was not sudden, and it was gradual, and it's still going on. So let's see what happened. So when the COVID struck, Lukashenko already was kind of experiencing, or Belarusian government, because he is, the government, experiencing economic difficulties because Russia just introduced the tax maneuver. So basically, Belarusian government could not handle COVID and left people alone. So people had to take care of themselves. So they started crowdfunding, sewing the masks, meeting together, contacting diaspora for help and surviving on their own. And basically people at that time saw that government is not delivering as promised. So new figures emerged for the 2020 presidential elections. After Lukashenko started suppressing the figures, he still could see, and everybody could see, that after Svetlana Tikhanovskaya emerged as a leader, because no one else was able to run, was gathering crowds and crowds of people behind her. You can see that on the picture. And even in the first place, she was not even embracing the historic white, red, white symbols. So Belarusian official flag is red and green, but historic symbols are white, red, white. So she was not even embracing that in the first place. It was later. So people saw that, yeah, there is a demand for change, but as always, as in previous elections, Lukashenko claimed 80%. He claimed that before. Since 1994, there were 5 elections. He claimed 80% before. There were protests before, but this one was different because people just started basically open their eyes and saw that Lukashenko, who was the guarantor of stability, the peace, and the representing the people, lied to them. So they said basically, let's go and show that we disagree. So plenty of people went outside to protest, and they were met with brutality and suppression and beatings and tortures. They're internationally documented. Belarus right now has about I don't remember the exact number, 1,700, almost 1,800 political prisoners, and that's unprecedented number. So at that time we can start talking about the crumbling, or let's say crumbling of the first pillar of the populism Lukashenko was relying to. So proximity to the people, no more, because people saw that he has blood on his hands. Because people in Belarus, every person, it is a nation of 9.5 million people, know someone who suffered from the beatings and brutality. Every person in Belarus knows someone who was fined or went to prison. So basically questioning the image. Then the second pillar, he was a guarantor of peace, but the war in Ukraine began, and Belarus, or as it appears in the news, they say Belarus is the other aggressor in Putin's war on Ukraine, because Lukashenko lost an ability to balance between the East and West, because people already demonstrated their disagreement with the regime. So he had no choice, but that's not what he promised. So it's actually not surprising that people of Belarus are against the war, because for 2 decades and even longer, they were told, they had been told that they are peaceful people. So that's why, Belarusian people are not Belarusian regime, and it's not actually correct to say that Belarus is the aggressor. It is more Belarusian government that the aggressor, not the Belarusian people. So that's also questioned. And even though Belarus formally did not send the troops to Ukraine, people in Belarus see the military equipment. They know that Belarus, the rockets were sent to Ukraine from the Belarusian territory, and that image is also being questioned. The third one, guarantor of stability. And again, stability is economy. So because Lukashenko lost his ability to negotiate with the West, and completely relies on Russia, and the economy is not transformed it's state-owned, and if he does not receive any loans from external loans, that's already not good. So, as everybody knows, Russia is under sanctions. Lukashenko and Belarusian government, and Belarus actually is also under sanctions, and formerly known as the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe is no more. So IT companies from Belarus left the country and currently are in Portugal, Poland, Baltic states, everywhere, but not in Belarus. And businesses are not going inside. Everybody is leaving the country. This does not look bright for the Belarusian regime. So we can see that even though the Belarusian people inside the country are suppressed, they're being suppressed, and they cannot voice their disagreements because everyone who is talking is being imprisoned, and the prison terms are really harsh and long. We know that, for example, the husband of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was sentenced for 18 years, and so these terms are unprecedented. We can see that these three pillars, their main pillars, are being crumbling, not fast. But we can see that people in Belarus, they actually woken up, and even though cannot do much at the moment under pressure, they are exposing or they're voicing their disagreements. So the conclusions for this, what we can observe right now. So Lukashenko's survival actually depends on the constellation of external rather than internal factors, because Belarusian people are suppressed right now. So externally organized Belarusian democratic movement prevents Lukashenko from effective balancing between East and West. We've seen before already that recently deceased McKay, Minister of Foreign Affairs, tried to send letters to the European Union, trying to begin some kind of support, saying we didn't do much, let's cooperate, and it did not find any support because, again, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is there, and even though the role of the Belarusian democratic movement might be questioned because it's been already 2 years and no changes have been done, that's an effective force to at least isolate Lukashenko and not allow him to sustain in power unless Putin is in power as well. So another conclusion is that Lukashenko maintains Russia's backing, and that's how he is managing to stay in power. But we see that Ukraine is providing a lifeline for a lot of countries, including Belarusian people and Belarus here. So they are showing their resistance, and the hope is that if Ukraine wins, or when Ukraine achieves its victory, Belarus might receive some kind of opportunity for change. Belarusian people they are playing the biggest role possible. There are a lot of people immigrated from the country. They fled because of repressions. Up to 300,000 people are living outside the country, and a lot of them are sitting right across the border in Poland and in Baltic states, Lithuania more specifically. These countries were tremendously supportive, and that's very much appreciated. So all these people want to go home. Again, the longer they stay, the less likely they will go, and that's understandable because they are going to be settling outside the country. But at the moment, people want to go home and build new life and build a new country. So Belarusian people, even though they are split between inside and outside, they have a major role to play. They are sending a signal that they are not supporting the Belarusian regime, and they are striving for changes. So, for example, one of the biggest messages in the war, during the war, is that Belarusians are not Lukashenko. It's not the same thing, that Belarusian people are fighting for Ukraine, and there is a battalion of Kalinovsky fighting and dying on the ground in Ukraine to help the neighbor and free the country, their own country. So on the final slide is that Belarusian people, they actually woke up after more than a quarter of a century of sleep. Let's kind of call them, don't read it literally, but that's basically what was happening, because people were protesting the Belarusian regime before, but not in these numbers. So they embraced white, red, white symbols, which are different from the official red and green symbols that are being observed as the ones that covered in blood and resulting from torture or tortures of Belarusian people. So they asserted their membership in a different community, imagined community, not the one associated with the Belarusian regime. And that helps the Belarusian people to sustain this mobilization mood when the external forces will line up and open a window, an opportunity for change in the country. I'm not saying, I might seem positive and optimistic. No, it's kind of unclear if that's going to happen, but at least the changes have been happening in the country, and there is a hope amidst all this brutality in the country that the hope might, the change might happen. Especially, it's also visible these days because these repressions in Belarus are not stopping. So essentially, the regime is observing that people that it needs to repress still, because the changes that we observed after 2020, they are not fading, essentially. So the threat is imminent, the threat is there, and the regime actually understands that. So the Belarusian people are hoping for support and hoping for change and hoping for opportunity, but in terms of the populism, the three pillars, the biggest pillars, have received the cracks in those structures, at least the cracks, and it's going to be just the time that hopefully shorter than longer time and until they crumble. So hopefully we will not have to wait till Lukashenko dies. Somehow from age, hopefully he and Putin go faster. That's all I wanted to say. So it's different from Baltic states. It's different populism. It's a different beast, but hopefully soon we'll be talking about democratic Belarus. We'll see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now pass it on to our moderator, Dr. Kaskamp, to go over our Q&A.
Yes, thank you. It is indeed a different beast in Belarus from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So thank you to all of the presenters for excellent, insightful, and enlightening presentations. Now's the opportunity for those of us who've been listening to chime in with their own observations, comments, or questions. To do so, you can either write something in the chat, or you can just show your hand, raise your hand, and I will give you the floor. But until we see someone raising their hand, I'll ask a question which is more to the three Baltic presenters than the last presentation, because it really doesn't apply, unfortunately, currently in the Belarusian case. What are the strategies that mainstream political parties use to deal with these populist challengers in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania? There are sort of many ways of going about this. In Western Europe, of course, there's countries like Belgium, and until recently, Sweden, France. You would have a cordon sanitaire, whereby these parties would be considered pariahs and no one would have anything to deal with them. But we've seen in the Baltic states that they've been part of government coalitions. But nonetheless, different mainstream forces have had various strategies to deal with this populist challenger. So I'd ask the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian presenters to comment on that, please. Whoever wants to go first.
I can start. So in the case of Lithuania, as you've heard during the presentation, so mainstream political parties, and especially social democrats being more on the left, they do cooperate with centrist populists so far, or even Order and Justice, they also did cooperate with them. I think the role of president also should be taken into consideration. At one point when Labour Party in Lithuania won a lot of mandates and was attempting to form the government, the Lithuanian president, Dalia Grybauskaitė, stepped in and said, no. So that's how, in the end, Social Democrats again led the government. As for the Homeland Union, which is on the right side of the spectrum, so far they did not have established so many coalitions with populist political parties, and at least in their discourse so far, they claim that they do not want to cooperate with those kind of parties. So that would be Lithuanian perspective, I would say.
I can go next. In Estonia, I think the parties have kind of done this differently. So currently, we have an election coming up, and the Reform Party, which is currently the Prime Minister party, which is progressive right-wing party, has kind of focused on being like the antipode of EKRE. So they are very much kind of opposing to EKRE and saying that they are the alternative to getting EKRE to power. This probably could be a success strategy for the party. As I also said, EKRE tries to kind of pivot the electoral choice space. I also mentioned that the Center Party has to some extent cooperated with EKRE. So when in 2015, the Reform Party was in government with the two smaller parties, EKRE and the Reform Party kind of cooperated in opposition, and Martin Helme has later thanked publicly the Center Party for this, because that's how they learned the ropes of parliamentary tactics and strategies. Now, maybe a less successful way, or another unsuccessful way, if you like, was what the Social Democrats did back in 2015. I don't know if you noticed in the graph, which just flew past you, the Social Democratic Party was actually a pretty popular party back in 2015 and before. But at some point, their chairman really started opposing to EKRE, which was still back then like a 5-10% party. It wasn't as relevant. And it kind of, I don't know if they tried to preempt the culture wars by starting the culture wars. And because of that, they maneuvered themselves in the corner of being this party which just deals with gay rights or issues like this. So they became like a really easy target for EKRE, and they didn't have like any other issues which could chime with their supporters. Another pretty typical strategy, which was partly also not that successful, was what the Isama, or the Pro-Patria party did. So this is also a conservative right-wing party, but more mainstream. So their reaction was to become EKRE light, also to kind of become more harsh on immigration and issues like these, but in a civilized manner, right? Which is what many authors kind of criticize as legitimating the far-right agenda. What this has done is Isama's ratings have also dropped, and they even kind of went under the electoral threshold in the party ratings at one point. But Isama has had this kingmaker position for the past 4 years. So whoever they agree to go into coalition with gets to govern. So for 2 years, they decided to govern with the Center Party and EKRE, and then for 2 years with the Reform Party and Social Democrats. So they are kind of able to fulfill different aspects of their agenda in those different coalitions, and maybe in the end might actually win from this, unlike what the typical kind of expectation is in this case. So the other parties have like very, very different strategies, I would say. Some are more successful perhaps than others.
So if I may add to add my voice to the discussion, in case of Latvia, it is yeah, it is to some extent a similar situation that it was mentioned. So the populist country, I mean, National Alliance Party, which was in fact invited to create the government, and the same situation was in case of who owns the state in 2018, which involved this country into the coalition. So it means that for the mainstream parties, it isn't, it is not necessary to cooperate with other than populist party. So it isn't an important obstacle to cooperate. And for a populist party, of course, it is a possibility to have power and to introduce and apply its ideas and create politics. But I would like to underline once more what I mentioned. I mean, the statement of the president, who made the statement before the election that he stated that populism is one of the biggest threat for democracy in Latvia. So it means that he, to some extent, seek to make the society and the another parties aware of such a threat. So it means that we should bear in mind and not cooperate with such parties.
All right, thank you for those enlightening answers. I see we have two questions in the chat, which are both related to violence. The first one is about the rhetoric of these parties. Does that sort of encourage or legitimize violent extremism in the countries that we're looking at? And the second one is, well, do you regard sort of the threat of sort of violence as potentially trying to overthrow the regime? Maybe there's the connection. The question is with the 6th of January in the US, but thinking of the recent events in Germany, perhaps that is also relevant. So again, maybe we can start with Lithuania.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So in the end of my presentation, I mentioned that the framing that was introduced by Farmers and Greens Union about a family and its connection to ethnic nation and Christian values and strong values and family values, etc., later on was taken on by Family March or Family Movement, which was established during COVID. So what did happen? So they organized the march. They call themselves a family movement, trying to connect what they're doing to Lithuanian independence movement of the 90s. And in summer of 2021, they mobilized rather a huge crowd and created a riot in front of the parliament. Yeah, so after that, some investigations started. Some of the organizers are persecuted or investigated, but it became violent, and that is really not common for Lithuania, as Marlene mentioned. In Lithuania, it's the same that people do not protest that much. It's not a common tradition, and riots are really rare. So that was kind of surprising and threatening. And in the end, what happened that after COVID pandemic became not that much important of the question, especially when the war started, that support for the movement, for family movement, has decreased. So it does not seem that those kind of violent actions could be repeated. But at the same time, it was kind of surprising, threatening, and worrying. Let's put it this way.
From Estonia or Latvia, a comment?
Yeah, I think the picture is pretty similar. As I also mentioned, Estonian protest culture is rather, let's say, pacified or peaceful. God, I hope not, right? Is the right answer here. And there is no kind of like previous history of having these kind of paramilitary wings, which would have been effective in the past 30 years at least. So let's hope this isn't the case. But of course, in order to answer that question, fully, we would need the capacities of an intelligence agency. So I really don't know what's bubbling beneath. Apologies for jumping in. I noticed there was another question also in the chat about the Holocaust discourse. So here I can answer for Estonia that it's not that much of an issue, but EKRE has been prompted occasionally about their kind of affinities with Nazism and so on. And the response of more amateur EKRE politicians was typically that, but why are you talking about Holocaust? Hitler also did good things, that he constructed good highways or things like this. And EKRE has gotten quite a lot of flack over, this kind of an attitude, but it's not something that they bring up deliberately. But they're not afraid of answering, because as I mentioned, their kind of modus operandi is to kind of provoke and escalate rhetorical conflict. So if somebody brought up the issue of Holocaust, then they would defend this kind of an answer if somebody gave it.
If I may, similarly to my colleagues, I wanted to say that I do not suppose any potential suppression created by the Riotor demonstration in Latvia, created by the populist parties. However, I'm not I do not suppose such situation, but we have to remember that during the COVID there were several different demonstrations, and they maybe not several participants took part in that, but they were quite vocal and loud. But it doesn't mean that they would, you know, provoke any dangerous situation for the political system in Latvia. And if I may also answer the question about Holocaust, because I haven't got enough knowledge about that. I mean, is this you know, very hot discussion? I mean, I'm not sure that it is not hot discussion in Latvia about the Holocaust, and I'm not sure if there any populist party includes such issue into the program or issues which are discussed. And only only one situation when the question of Holocaust was discussed was associated with the discussion about refusing the property of Jewish, but it was discussion provoked rather by Jewish diaspora in America rather than Jewish people inside Latvia. So it's rather, you know, discussion influenced from out of country rather than a domestic issue.
I would also like to hear from Tatiana. She's being kind of left out here. Mari-Liis, you had a question for Tatiana, but rather than me reading it, perhaps you can ask.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that one of the, yeah, sorry, my co-author is here as well. So about the proximity to the people, you mentioned that this has waned in case of Lukashenko. Do you mean that it has waned like based on his, you know, strategies? If you beat your own people, then this means that you're not really trying to be one of your people or close to them? Or has Lukashenko's kind of rhetoric or discourse also changed, that he doesn't really try to look like, you know, the man of the people anymore, because everybody's got someone who has been, you know, hurt in his repressions? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I don't feel left out. Don't worry. I feel like I was so clear that no questions are needed. Thank you for the question. So Lukashenko has been suppressing opposition for decades, you know. So there is this opposition. They're calling it old opposition, the parties that are in opposition. This time, it is people. So people, this Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, for example, in the first place, she did not even want it to be called opposition, you know. So these people, new protest movement, they didn't want to be called opposition because opposition is old opposition. So, but they are opposing the regime. So essentially he is beating the people, but in his rhetoric, he's saying this, he's calling these protesters, whatever names, terrorists, you know, all kinds of labels putting on them. You know, he is trying to be and remain as one of you know, representing the people, being close to people, but the situation itself is showing that it's no longer the case, that the majority of people actually noticed that he is not who he wants to be portrayed with. It should not be we should not be mistaken that basically saying no, he has no supporters. He does, but we need to understand that there are less of them and more people who woken up, and whatever he labels, them. You know, he's continuing his talks and nonsense speeches that at some point I actually stopped listening, because he's like, whatever he's saying, you just need to look at actions. Whatever he's doing, that's what matters, because he can say whatever he wants, and that's just talk. Hope I answered.
Okay, thank you. Bullet has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anders, and thank you very much for the excellent and comprehensive presentations and vivid discussions. My questions is about this transnational or trans societal relations with these populist elements in your countries with other countries populist, like you mentioned, for instance, Tatiana mentioned the Russian support for Lukashenko, but maybe it will be good to hear some other elements cooperated or collaborated with some transnational populists like Le Pen or Italian populists or Nordic populists or East European, Central European populists. How this mechanism functions in your region, especially in Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania? Thank you.
I know that Mari-Liis has recently published on that very issue.
Yeah, it's a big long issue. It deserves its own event. But yeah, I mean, there are multiple facets to it. So when we talk about EKRE, first off, EKRE is a particular party in the broader Estonian context because it has branch organizations abroad. And it's really successful in mobilizing the external vote. So Estonians who are residing abroad, 44% of them voted for EKRE in the last election. But there are other facets as well. For instance, the populists within the Baltic states are really well networked. So they have signed the Bauska Declaration in 2013, where they agreed to kind of stand up for joint values, fighting against cultural Marxism and building or defending the nation states and so on. And thirdly, there are these affinities to other countries' populists. So Marine Le Pen, Steve Bannon, whoever, they've all visited Estonia at some point, building up this kind of a populist international, right? And EKRE kind of has a lot of these role models. So they bring up the Hungarian example very often in domestic debates. ECRA's members started a parliamentary support group for Donald Trump and the Estonian parliament, for instance. And when Trump was no longer a president, they kind of decided to make it a support group for the values that Donald Trump stands for more broadly. So this transnational element is really there in like almost any facet of what they do.
Of course, we also have to add here the connections in the European Parliament, right? But we're coming to the end of our time, so anyone else who wants to comment on this very briefly, please.
Sure, I can add that during that march or protest movement that I mentioned, that family march, so there was representative from AfD who gave a short talk, or yeah, let's put it this way. There are other populist radical rights organizations or parties in Lithuania, which are not parliamentary parties, and they still do not enter the parliament, but they cooperate with Fidesz, they cooperate with and support Orban, they support Trump, and the party that I mentioned, the Farmers and Greens Union. So it seems that they took example from a Polish leading party, from PiS. So there are many examples to follow.
So the last word from Alexandra or Tatiana?
from me is
only-
thank you for
yes.
having me and listening about sorry. Thank you for having me listening and learning, I mean, about this different beast of Belarus, and thank you for support actually from the European Union neighbors for all this nonsense that has been going on. You know. Thank you.
Alexander?
Yeah, apart from those examples, I mean, in context of transnationalism, of populism in the Baltic states, I wanted to add another example, because as I mentioned, the party of Latvia's First, which without any doubt is a example of some kind of cooperation, maybe not cooperation, but similarity or similarity with Donald Trump, America's First. So it means that this populist party exemplifies the stability necessity for creating strong Latvian society. Yeah, so in that sense, we can also say about those ideas flow with and crossing the borders. Yeah.
Okay, thank you to all of the presenters again for a very fascinating discussion. We've all learned a lot, and now let me hand over to Martin to conclude on the part of the center.
Yes, again, thank you so much. These were incredibly insightful presentations. And Dr. Kaskam, thank you very much for your attentive moderation. And the attendees, thank you very much. This was there was a lot of questions and a lot of very good thought-provoking questions and remarks. This series so far has covered pretty much all the regions of Europe. And we return next year to cover 3 thematic sessions. The first will be on the 26th of January, with a panel on populism, gender, and sexuality, followed by populism and migration. And the third panel will be around populism and its effect on EU resilience. Following that, we will begin on our sort of mapping global populism, where we will focus on different countries and regions around the globe. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And we hope that you have a very happy holidays and a happy new year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.